General Howe and his men hightailed it out of Boston and went to Canada. Canada was Britain's safe space. It was also a British colony, but the people there weren't shooting at the British like Americans were. Howe was joined there by more ships, more men, and more guns coming in from Britain. It became the home base of the mightiest force ever sent across an ocean up until that time. The Continental Congress ordered American militia to attack Canada, but that failed. They would try again more times in the future and fail every time. Canada never became the 14th colony. Meanwhile, the 13 colonies started asking each other what they were fighting for. They would answer that question in 1776. In Philadelphia, representatives of the 13 colonies met for the second time in the Second Continental Congress. These were the ones who appointed George Washington to lead the army, which was a good decision, and ordered the invasion of Canada, which was a bad decision. But what were they fighting for? Most Americans hoped to bloody Britain's nose to teach them to respect their rights as British citizens. Some wanted to kiss and make up with Britain as soon as possible. And a few hardy souls started talking about gaining full independence. But this was a kooky idea at the start of 1776. No colony had ever won independence through war before. They'd be cut off from British trade and become 13 separate, broke-ass, weak-ass independent countries. They would be sitting ducks for more powerful countries like France or Britain. But a British writer visiting America in 1776 named Thomas Paine printed the best-selling essay of the century. It was called Common Sense, and the title says it all. Paine said, "America, you're bigger than Britain. You're far away from Britain. Why are you so scared of them? If you don't want to be 13 broke-ass countries, then unite into one big-ass country. Then you could start over with a new government, one that doesn't need a king. Why do you need a king? Look at what the king is doing to you now." These ideas were new in America at the time. Most Americans blame Parliament for their problems, but still remain loyal to the king. In fact, they had been begging the king to help save them from the Parliament. But here was Thomas Paine telling them, "King, Parliament, they were all ops. Make your own country and start from scratch without a king." Paine's bold ideas took the country by storm. He wrote in simple words that anyone can understand, an 18th century version of an internet meme. Members of the Continental Congress then started talking openly about gaining independence from Britain. But could they unite and build a government of their own? Only time would tell. King George III didn't do anything to help himself either. He threatened to hang the Continental Congress as traitors. Americans from Lexington and Massachusetts down to Charleston and South Carolina had been attacked by his soldiers. Many Americans became convinced that their only choice now was becoming independent. But how many Americans were willing to put their lives on the line for this? After all, men were already walking away from George Washington's army. Every time British soldiers marched through a city, some Americans would come out to celebrate. There were still many loyalists around. The Continental Congress needed to explain to Americans why they should fight for independence. And that job fell to a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a 1,000-page letter, the Declaration of Independence, that summarized all the bad things Britain had done to America in a kind of greatest hits or 13 reasons why list. He mentioned specific things like imposing taxes on us without our consent, quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, and, last on the list, starting domestic insurrection against us, or, in other words, slave revolts. There was something on the list for everyone, something that had directly touched every American. In the final paragraph, he referred to these united colonies because everyone, New Englanders, Southerners, and everyone in between, were in this together. And who caused all these problems? The king. Jefferson blamed the king for everything. In one 1,000-word letter, Jefferson rephrased what Thomas Paine had written earlier that year. Americans should become independent, unite with each other, and throw the king out. The Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. At 1,000 words, it was short enough to copy and be sent to all 13 colonies so they could post it in windows or read it aloud in public. People in churches and town squares heard it. In short, it went viral. The public reading in New York City resulted in the crowd pulling down the statue of George III, the 18th century version of getting likes. And it took guts for New Yorkers to do this at the time, because New York was Britain's next target. The British needed a city in which their navy could dock, and New York City had the best natural harbor in the Americas. They needed a staging area for their soldiers, and New York wouldn't have people shooting at them like Boston. Like the South, so much of New York City's economy depended on trade with Britain, ensuring there would be plenty of loyalists there to help them. Throughout the summer of 1776, General Howe assembled his massive army in Staten Island, including 8,000 German soldiers from the state of Hesse. George Washington was determined to hold on to New York City. On top of being a valuable seaport, it was the gateway to New England, from where he recruited most of his soldiers. If the British controlled New York, New England would be isolated from the other colonies. New York was the neck of the American snake. Washington was determined not to let Britain strangle it. He split his 20,000 troops between Brooklyn and Manhattan, ordering them to build walls for defense like they did on Breed's Hill. They stationed cannon from the battery in the south of Manhattan to Harlem in the north. In Brooklyn, Washington occupied the high ground that could oversee the entire city, an area called Brooklyn Heights today. He watched as British ships ferried their massive army over the water from Staten Island into Brooklyn. One New Yorker said it looked like the entire city of London was coming at them. After the British landed in Brooklyn, they marched west over the flatlands approaching Brooklyn Heights. British and German soldiers attacked the Americans in a vicious assault on Brooklyn Heights, and the Americans eventually retreated. After a day of battle, Washington realized he would have to evacuate his men from Brooklyn altogether before his entire army was destroyed. As rain fell on the evening of August 29, 1776, Washington instructed his army to gather their gear and prepare for an attack. He directed them to the banks of the East River, where flat-bottom boats rowed them across the East River to Manhattan. They weren't attacking anything at all. They were retreating. The boats brought them to Lower Manhattan, then came back to Brooklyn to pick up more men. For 6 straight hours, the boats ferried back and forth, picking up and dropping off men, guns, and ammunition. Then the sun started to rise, and Washington feared that the British would discover what they were doing and cut them off. He was the last man to leave Brooklyn. Only a heavy morning fog prevented the British from discovering their retreat. By the time the British did discover what happened, it was too late. All of Washington's men and ammunition were on Manhattan Island. It was technically a victory for the British and celebrated as such back in Britain. But Washington had pulled off one of the most daring retreats in military history, living to fight another day. But how many days did he actually have left? Manhattan was an awful place for him to be. The British could surround the island with their mighty navy and the whole war would be over. As much as Washington wanted to keep control of New York City, he realized he needed to get off the island as soon as possible. While Howe took a sweet-ass time getting over to Manhattan, Washington gathered his men in modern-day Washington Heights to cross the Hudson River into New Jersey, right around where the bridge that bears his name is located today. They had to cross into Jersey, leaving the British in control of New York City. But before he left, mysterious fires broke out all over Manhattan. Chances are it was Washington and his men who started them, so the British wouldn't have shelter or supplies. But the fact still stood. Britain had taken New York City and its valuable harbor. Meanwhile, Washington's army retreated deeper into New Jersey. A cold winter was starting to set in. One of his best generals, Charles Lee, was captured by the British. Washington was clearly losing the war. His soldiers started deserting to go back home. He counted no more than 6,000 men under his command, describing many of them as entirely naked and unfit for service. They would not survive another British attack. But thankfully for him, they didn't have to worry about that. General Howe was a man who played by European rules of war, and the rules told him that you don't fight in winter. Instead of chasing Washington, he prepared to take it easy for the Christmas season. His main generals left for vacation while he built a bunch of small forts across New Jersey to defend the approaches to New York City, which became his new home base. This highlighted a major problem that would plague the British Army for the rest of the war. They weren't killers. They didn't have a killer instinct. When Washington was on the ropes and needed that last knockout punch, the British never delivered it. There would be several times during the war when one more attack, one more push, would knock Washington out of the war. But the British never did that, and Washington was going to take advantage of it. But after losing New York City, Washington still needed a miracle. And what better time for one than Christmas? He was just across the icy Delaware River from the city of Trenton, where around 1,500 German Hessian soldiers occupied the city. Once again, Washington used nighttime boat rides to transport his troops. But they weren't running away this time, they were attacking. After getting off the boats, they marched towards Trenton, arriving there around 8 a.m. It was a quaint little town with charming country homes, every one of them occupied by sleepy Hessian soldiers, many of whom were dealing with hangovers from a night of Christmas drinking. They noticed movement outside of their windows and then heard artillery fire. They were under attack. Americans swarmed them from every direction. After 45 minutes of vicious face-to-face combat with bayonets, it was all over. The Americans won, taking 900 Hessian prisoners while they barely lost anyone at all. The British generals had to cut their vacation short, and they were very salty about it. They sent 8,000 soldiers into New Jersey to smash the Americans once and for all, closing in on Washington by New Year's Day, 1777. But Washington wouldn't run away. He wheeled his men through the woods around the lumbering British army and hit them again at the college town of Princeton. This time, he took another 200 prisoners before disappearing into western New Jersey. The battles of Trenton and Princeton were psychological victories for Washington. Americans proved they could beat professional European troops. Many men were convinced to stay in the army, and new men were convinced to join. Residents of New Jersey were forced to quarter British and Hessian troops in their homes, and their farms were stripped bare, causing Americans who might have been loyal to the British to start hating them. More and more Americans were being convinced that they both could and should have independence.